And now we'll see where my controls went. So there they are. Thank you for this. I'm going to try to be somewhere close to as interesting as the discussion following the previous talk. And what I will be talking about is evaluation strategies for cybersecurity training methods, on which I conducted a literature review. So the agenda is perhaps not so surprising, some problem area and background, and then I will zoom in on the aim of this study, how I performed it, and what the results and conclusions were. So for some quick problem area, we all know that cybersecurity is of course important. I'm not going to spend more time discussing that. I think we can all agree as well that user behavior is a root cause or part of many, if not most, incidents that happen out there. And as we've seen throughout this conference and throughout other conferences and papers, and from the practice, training of end users is a commonly proposed solution that is both used and proposed then to solve the problem. However, we can see that despite the use of training, the problem still persists, where we have users still responding to phishing, still answers, still creating bad passwords, still trying to avoid to follow security policies, and so on and so forth, has been exemplified throughout this conference. So I had a look at why this can be. As I said, we are quite well aware of, or we at least perceive cybersecurity training to be a good thing. And the goal of any cybersecurity training effort is, of course, to support users to behave in a desired, secure way. And I write desired here because we usually describe a desired way of behaving through the use of policies. And if we look at the research for an answer to why current methods for training are not effective enough, there are several reasons that are argued for. One of them is that knowledge does not need to translate to behavior. So just because we train people to do a certain thing when they are supposed to create a password, it doesn't mean that they are doing that. We saw an example of that in a previous presentation about policies. If users feel that whatever we're trying to make them do is hindering instead of enabling their work, they will, at least some of them will, go and do something else. We also see that users may not participate in training to a large enough extent. So even if we have an organization that is providing training in one way or another, users do not actively participate in that training to a large enough extent. And that means, of course, that the desired effect of the training is lost for the users who do not participate. And the final reason that I found in some studies is that is the argument that training methods are not sufficiently evaluated or not correctly evaluated. So we, in practice, we provide training to users, but we don't really know if that training is to be successful or not. So if I make a note on evaluation, and again, the goal of any training effort is, of course, to support users to behave in a secure way. And it's quite easy to conclude that evaluating a training effort based on the effect on behavior would be the go-to approach. But if you again look to the literature, you see that it's perhaps not quite so easy. First of all, if we want to evaluate the effect on actual behavior, what we need to do is experiment. And experiment is, in this domain, is the resource consuming and practically challenging. I would, if I make a personal reflection, say that this is perhaps a poor reason not to experiment, but it's still a reason that is given in some reported work. Perhaps the more severe challenge with experiments on users' behavior is that it's ethically challenging, and it raises the question of how far can we go. So if we do a phishing campaign, for instance, and we want to see how susceptible users are to clicking a link and giving us the password, how far can we go? Is it ethical to do that without the user knowing? And then what is it okay for us to measure? So can we measure that the user clicks the link? Can we measure that the user inputs some value? Can we also measure if that value is indeed a correct password? Because it's really only when we measure that the user inputs the correct password, we are sure that the user actually fell for the phishing attempt. A final obstacle when we experiment on user behavior is the risk of participation bias. And this is, of course, when we experiment on users that are aware that they are participating, then the awareness that you are participating in a security study risks increasing the user awareness and scramble the results. So there is perhaps a need for complementary methods of evaluation. So the role of this paper is to explore recently published work in the domain of end user cybersecurity training. And the intention is to identify how such training methods are evaluated and outline considerations relating to the identified evaluation methods. So essentially, how is this being done? What methods are used, and what can they give us and what can't they give us? So the intention is to provide an overview then of the different methods and essentially the pros and cons from all of them. So the methodology is a structured literature review. The aim is, after all, to look into how research have evaluated training efforts in the past. And I did this with a rather broad search query, which was basically security and training or education and user. I tried to have it without the user appended to really be sure that nothing got lost. But then I had, well, far too many hits. I could still see, as you'll see in a little while, that this is a search query that generates quite a few false positives. But when I tried to explore how I could make it more narrow, I saw that I lost results when I added more search terms or tried to modify the logic. So I didn't want to do that and accepted more manual labor instead in the selection process. The database I used was Scopus, Web of Science, and Science Direct because, well, they index quite a lot of quality scientific work. I also used the DBLP for the same purpose, and I specifically included Usenix because I know from experience that they publish a lot of work relevant to the study. I expressed some inclusion criteria, so I wanted to include papers published in 2015 or later to focus on the recent research. It should be peer-reviewed and published in a conference or journal. It should be free to access for me. It should be written in English. I suppose Swedish would also have been okay. It should be on the topic of the study, and most importantly, it should report on one or more evaluations of security and awareness training methods. My method of analysis was thematic coding in 3 steps, where I first read all the individual training and identified methods of cybersecurity training that they discussed. I then read the papers again, this time with a focus on identifying individual ways of evaluating the training methods. And then in the final step, once again read the papers and analyzed the goals and outcomes of the evaluation. And at this stage, I had put special attention to how the authors argued for what evaluation methods they selected, and how the authors perceived that that their evaluations would contribute to the results in their cases. So for some results, after the initial searches, I had 3,664 candidate papers. I downloaded all abstracts and citation information and loaded that into EndNote, which was kind enough to automatically remove any duplicates. Then I scanned through all titles and abstracts to remove papers that were clearly out of scope. As I'm sure you can imagine, with this quite large mass of candidate papers, there were quite a lot of papers that were very clearly out of scope. And in all honesty, I didn't scan the abstracts of papers with very telling titles. 106 papers remained after this step, and I then scanned the full papers to remove papers that were out of scope, and remained with 28 papers that were included in the analysis. So if we look through the analysis and the results of that in brief, I first made a short overview of what cybersecurity training methods that were analyzed or evaluated in the papers that I found. While I didn't really propose this as a big part of my paper, I still wanted to show you that papers evaluating various efforts into gamification or situation-aware training are by far actually the most mentioned training methods in the included papers in this work, where gamification is where you use game elements as a central part of the training method, and situation-aware training is when you deliver training in a situation where it is usable. And the common description of situation-aware training is to have training as part of a phishing campaign. So the typical way of doing situation-aware training in this body of literature is that you launch a fake phishing campaign in an organization, and then when a user clicks a link, you provide them with training. And there were also some papers that discussed and evaluated several different training methods. So for the second round of reading, I focused on the evaluation methods and found basically 4 perception evaluations, where the evaluations focus on the user perception of a training method, essentially to what degree the users like working with it. And this includes both usability studies and studies that tries to measure the user's self-efficacy, namely how able the users perceive themselves to be in the cybersecurity world. The other category that I found was knowledge evaluations, which basically measure the knowledge gained by a participant using a certain method of training. And then I found simulations and experimental evaluations, and both of those try to measure security outcomes, i.e. The effect that training has on actual security behavior. And the difference between the two is that simulations do it usually in a constructed case within a controlled environment, whereas experimental evaluations evaluate the result of training in a completely naturalistic setting. I looked at how those different evaluation types are used, and it's quite even. We can see that all 4 of those evaluation types are used in the literature that I assessed, even if simulation is used a little bit more than the others. So what does this mean? So I'm just going to briefly go through the 4 and the pros and cons and the considerations that I found with the evaluations. So evaluations of perception, as I said, evaluates the participant's perception of the own skill or their perception of a training method. And the common rationale for this type of evaluation is that a positive user perception is argued to increase the chance of user adoption. The obvious shortcoming is, of course, that user behavior is not measured. So we can know that if the users like the training, but we can't know what it actually brings to the table. This is commonly done using interviews or surveys, and it is worthwhile that it can be prone to response bias. So that is a factor to take notice of when designing this kind of evaluations. When we have the knowledge-based evaluations, we essentially evaluate a user's actual knowledge. And the rationale here is that knowledge is a precondition to correct behavior. And this is sometimes argued to make knowledge-based evaluations a proxy for evaluation of actual behavior. And further argument is that it's easier to perform. The shortcoming is, of course, again, that actual behavior is not measured. And if we look to the body of literature, we see that we can't be sure that knowing how to act will result in acting accordingly. Knowledge-based evaluations are often survey-based or in a type of quiz. And it's worth mentioning that the risk of response bias is less compared to perception evaluation because, well, we assume that users will perform as good as they can when we evaluate the knowledge. Looking at simulation evaluations, we measure the effect on security behavior in a simulated environment. The most common type of study that I found is to subject participants to training and then have them classify between legitimate and fraudulent emails. Something that was mentioned in several of the included studies was that the risk of bias is quite large. And the argument here is that a respondent is going to be better at identifying fraudulent emails when that is given as a specific task. And this is a real struggle here because we can see in quite a lot of research that when we look at how good people are at identifying phishing after we told them to do that, they are quite good at identifying phishing. But when we look at how well phishing attacks work in reality, and when we talk to cybersecurity professionals who work with penetration testing, they will tell you that if they launch a specific spear phishing attack against an organization, it will almost always be successful. So there is quite a bit of contradiction here. And while I don't have any empirical evidence to back it up, I believe that participation bias is a big part of the answer. A benefit with those evaluations is that they don't suffer from ethical and procedural challenges in the same way as naturalistic experiments, which I will come to in a little while. And another benefit that I didn't find in the paper but added myself is that simulations allow for better isolation of the effect of a single measure. So there is still potential to have really good results with simulation. So the experimental evaluations then will measure the effect on security behavior in the wild or in the real world, and it typically uses penetration testing techniques to measure behavior after training is deployed in an organization. And this is argued to be able to identify the true effect of training, even if it can be hard to find the causality, because a challenge is that it's hard to isolate confounding variables. And the biggest downside or problem with experiments, as I found in the literature, is that they are quite often ethically challenging. It's hard to, well, you can't really, or it's hard to provide the participants with an informed consent. And even if you find a way to have a partial informed consent, you will still have to include some part of deception in the study, because, well, deception is usually the nature of at least social engineering campaigns. So some additional findings. Something that was discussed quite a lot in the paper was the study design, whether you should use one case, pre-post, or between group experiment, and focusing on pre-post and between group approaches. The pre-post approach attempts to isolate the effect of a single measure, but it's also argued to be more prone to participation bias. Because even if the idea is to do a pre-test and do the measure and then do the post-test, the mere exposure to the pre-test is likely to affect the outcome of the post-test. The between group version then is less prone to participation bias, but it's also less able to isolate the effect of a measure from confounding variables. So there seemed to be a trade-off. And if you read some of the old literature on experiments, there is a way to combine these two and then hopefully find the gold standard, but then you also find the gold standard of complexity, unfortunately. Several studies argued that participation bias is especially risky in studies on awareness. I don't really have an answer to how to overcome that, but I think it's worthwhile to have in the back of your mind when you study awareness. Two variables that were discussed as important to consider was knowledge retention. Several papers discussed how long the effect of training stays, but it was only measured in a few. And we know that knowledge gained from training does have an expiration date, and as a consequence of that, training programs need to tackle knowledge retention in one way or another. Another variable was willingness to participate in training. It was discussed in two of the included training where the user's willingness to participate voluntarily in the training method that was tested was questioned. And I argue that this aspect highlights the need for perception evaluations. And what's important here, what I want to emphasize is that it's easy to get carried away and evaluate evaluate whatever you do and come up with a good result. And then you sort of forget to ask the users if this is something that they would actually use if it was presented to them as part of their ordinary work experience. That's a mistake I admit to having done a few times myself. So to summarize the key findings, different training approaches or different evaluation approaches provide different value. At least the effect on behavior and user perception should be evaluated because they do bring significantly different things to the table. Understanding and minimizing the risk of bias is crucial, or at least putting the results that you find during your study, framing that with the potential bias that may have been in effect. There is a need to understand ethical challenges with experiments in this domain because they do pose, the ethical challenges are undeniably there. And knowledge retention and user willingness to participate in training are two key aspects that ought to be addressed in future work evaluating cybersecurity training. And that was it. So I know that I am the only thing standing